And so I've only been eating beef fundamentally, for almost 5 years now. And I've talked to hundreds of people, and we've had messages from thousands of people showing that this is, first of all, radically effective as a weight loss strategy, and also seems to produce remarkable effects on the general disease symptom front. Back in November of 2021, there was a study published by a Harvard group, which wasn't a perfect study because it was retrospective self-report, but they they assessed 2,500 people who had been on a carnivore diet for 6 months and showed something approximating a 90% reduction in all disease symptoms. And it was the only scientific paper I ever read where the surprise of the researchers was palpable between the lines in the scientific writing. Because, in a scientific article, all that emotion, negative or positive, is pretty much ironed out. But these people were so shocked by what they found that it couldn't help leaking into the document. And so, well, this has been quite surprising to me, because I never imagined in my wildest dreams, number one, that you could just live on meat, number two, that it would have such a salutary effect. So for me, guy lost 52 pounds in 7 months. I went from 212 pounds to 165, which is exactly what I weighed when I was 23. And I've maintained that weight since. I can put on muscle mass with no problem, even though I'm 62. I had a host of inflammatory conditions, some of which were quite serious, including peripheral uveitis, which sometimes blinds people, in my right eye, and it disappeared completely, along with psoriasis and gastric reflux disorder, and, interestingly enough, gum disease, which is technically incurable, which is linked to cardiovascular degeneration, and which has gone away 100% in my case, according to multiple measures that my dentists have taken. And so, and I've talked to many people who've lost like 100 pounds in a year, because they come to my talks, and who are just beside themselves, so to speak, as a consequence of experimenting with this diet. So that's the story. It's very strange. I don't talk about it that much because I'm not a nutritionist and because I'm still shell-shocked by it. But I'll tell you, it's something to be 60 and to have the same essential body morphology that I had when I was 23. And that had all disappeared from me in my early 50s.
Yeah, you're not the first person I've heard this story from, Jordan. And I have to be honest with you, I just don't know how to explain it. The weight loss, by the way, is not the harder part to explain, right? So the more restrictive any diet is, the more one loses weight on average, right? So it wouldn't surprise me if we put a person on the all potato diet if they would lose weight. Whereas if you put somebody on the no lettuce diet, nobody's going to lose an ounce. So more restrictive diets, ketogenic diets, which are not as restrictive as what you're doing, are also very effective for weight loss. By the way, so is a zero fat diet. Now, it's a unpalatable diet, and I don't think it's a particularly healthy diet when you start restricting fat that much. The more interesting question to me is, and I could certainly understand if you would say, I have no desire to experiment further by introducing other elements to see if I can preserve this phenotype. But the most interesting question to me is, what are the other foods out there that you might be able to consume? Or in the case of your daughter, right? Like, is it?
I'm obviously interested in that too. But what I have found, because I have now and then tried to eat carbohydrates, what I have found is that if I eat any of them, I start to crave them intensely. If I don't eat them at all, they don't bother me, assuming, and this goes to the calorie restriction issue, one of the ways of maintaining yourself on a keto diet or a carnivore diet, let's say, is to make sure you're never hungry. And I eat a lot of meat and a lot of high-fat meat, and so I'm never hungry. And I don't think that I'm calorie restricted at all because, I can eat a tomahawk steak sometimes in one sitting, which is about 35 ounces of meat. I never get hungry, and I eat high-fat carnivore snacks too. What I found is as long as I'm never hungry, then I'm not inclined to cheat. But if I do try something like an introduction of carbohydrates, first of all, some of my symptoms come back right away, like the GERDs, and I start craving like mad. So that's my
is it all carbohydrates, or like, for example, if you introduce vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, what happens, both symptom-wise and craving-wise?
Yeah, well, for a while I was eating nothing but meat and greens, but I still had some residual symptoms. My wife has a host of immunological problems that are somewhat low level, and I have a different host, and Michaela seemed to get all of them. And so, maybe we're absurdly sensitive for reasons that wouldn't be true of other people. But it's definitely the case that I do better. And believe me, this isn't something I particularly want. It is the case that I do better if I just stick to beef. Now, could I have pork and chicken? I had a very terrible bout of ill health, and I'm disinclined to do a lot of experimentation, although I'll probably try again in the future sometime. But I do know that beef works. We've been hypothesizing internally in our family, for what it's worth, is that the reason that beef works and that other ruminant animals, bison, so forth, lamb, goat, is because they process what they eat through so many stomachs that by the time it is actually turned into meat, there's pretty much nothing else there. So it's a very purified form of nutritional, very purified form of food. Now, like I said, that's anecdotal, and this is partly why I don't talk about it. But I can tell you, after you've talked to 1,000 people who tell you the same anecdote, you don't have an anecdote anymore. You have a hypothesis. And it's really quite something seeing these people who show me pictures of what they looked like a year ago. And, they were carrying around an extra person with them. And they're still shell-shocked by the transformation, because it's really something to lose, say, 150 pounds in a year. And so, I don't know what to make of that. I do know that the diet has actually been rejuvenating for my wife and I. Like, its effect on muscle tone has to be seen to be believed. And that's true even though both of us are 60. Like, my wife is in better shape from a musculature perspective now at 63 than she was when she was 40. And she was a very physically fit person who was exercising constantly and who was in pretty damn good shape. And to see that reverse rather than just, stop deteriorating, I don't really know what to make of it.
I would love it to be studied prospectively. I'm very curious as to what's going on, in particular with that. I mean, there are lots of data out there showing the efficacy of a ketogenic diet in the amelioration of type 2 diabetes. I do think, look, when it comes to type 2 diabetes, any amount of weight loss is going to produce a benefit, but it seems that a ketogenic diet has the easiest compliance, and there might be something to the fact that it's kind of removing the thing of which there is an excess, right? By at least taking away the thing that is in most excess, it's easier to kickstart that. A fast, of course, is also a great way to kickstart that, right? Something about taking glycogen levels down in the liver and the muscle makes this easier.
Well, the advantage too of the diet, the carnivore diet in particular, is because you can eat as much as you want. It's actually not a diet. The problem with diets is that they require privation, and they require almost continual privation, and then they also tend to produce a yo-yo effect. And that's partly because if you get in a fight with your hypothalamus, which drives hunger, you're going to lose because it's there to make damn sure you don't starve. And the probability that you can override it for any length of time, well, it's very, very low. And that probably varies from person to person for all sorts of reasons. But you don't want to get in a scrap with your lower level motivational systems. Now, if I ever start to crave a banana split, for example, I can just eat another 5 or 6 ounces of steak, and then I don't care. It's not like it wouldn't taste good, but it doesn't preoccupy me the way it would if I was hungry. I've really noticed this when I go into grocery stores, because if I go into a grocery store after having consumed enough meat, then the provision of this infinite display of delicious foods really doesn't affect me much. But boy, if I ever go into a grocery store when I'm hungry, that's quite the pain in the neck, because everything's delightful and tempting, So the fact that you can eat enough or even as much as you want on a keto or carnivore diet does seem to distinguish it in some ways from the diets that depend more particularly on mere calorie restriction. So I noticed that as I got older, my ability to concentrate when I was reading was deteriorating. So when I was 25, 30, if I picked up a book and read it, I would shut everything else out, and I would concentrate on, focus on, attend to what I was reading, read every word and understand it with no problem. But that started to deteriorate as I got older, and I noticed that it took an increasing amount of effort to shut everything off, and that instead of reading as deeply as I was sort of glancing at the words. And when I started this carnivore diet, that reversed, and I can now, I actually think this is true. I think I can read faster and more efficiently than I could when I was in my 20s.